It was supposed to be a peaceful solo hike, just a way to clear my mind and take in some of the rugged beauty of the Sierra Nevada mountains. I had planned it out for weeks. One of those hikes that would take me deep into the wilderness, away from the noise and pressure of everyday life. Just me, the trail, and the towering pines. No one else, just peace. I had read all the guides, checked the weather, and made sure my gear was solid. A new pair of boots, a reliable backpack, a light tent, and all the basics. Water filter, enough food for the trip, a first aid kit, a map, and compass. My pack wasn't too heavy, but I was still conscious of how the weight shifted on my back as I walked. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well worn, and I passed a few hikers here and there, all with the same goal: to get to a place where they could feel alone, if only for a little while. I didn't think much of it, just the usual friendly wave and nod. I was in my early 30s, healthy, but not the kind of person who had any delusions about nature's dangers. I knew the risks: weather, wildlife, getting lost. But I trusted my preparation and experience. I had done a few solo trips before, nothing major, but enough to know how to handle myself. I made my way past the last sign of civilization, just a couple of cabins tucked away in the trees, barely visible behind the thick brush. The trail narrowed, winding through the trees, and the sound of cars on the distant highway faded. The silence was thick and comforting. The air smelled fresh, almost sweet, with that damp, earthy scent that always comes after rain. But I noticed it wasn't just fresh air I was breathing in. Something else was there too. The woods had a sharpness to them, something I couldn't quite place. The feeling. The sun had started to dip, casting long shadows across the trail. I knew I was a good couple of hours away from the designated campsite I had in mind for the night, but I didn't feel rushed. I had planned to get there well before sunset. The light was beginning to lose its warmth, turning that soft orange as I continued. The higher I went, the quieter it became, and eventually the trail grew steep. The switchbacks climbed higher into the forested slopes. The trees here were older, towering. The ground beneath me was littered with pine needles and the occasional rock, making each step a little more uncertain. As I reached a small plateau to catch my breath, I stopped and looked around. The view was breathtaking. The valley below was bathed in the fading light, and the jagged mountain peaks stood tall in the distance, their snow-covered tops just visible against the now darkening sky. There was nothing but wilderness in every direction. I felt a quiet thrill in my chest, the kind that comes with knowing you're truly alone in a place so wild and untouched. But something about the silence, the thick air, made me uneasy. It wasn't that I was scared. It was something else, something I couldn't put into words. It felt as if the woods were listening, watching me. I shook it off. It wasn't until I'd been hiking for another hour that I began to hear a sound that didn't belong, a rustling in the underbrush. I paused, letting the sound catch my attention. I was immediately on alert. The rustling came again, a little louder this time, then silence. I looked around but saw nothing, just the trees and the steady incline ahead. My heart rate sped up, but I told myself to stay calm. It was probably just a deer or a squirrel, something harmless. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The feeling grew as I continued up the trail, a strange prickling on the back of my neck. I could hear the occasional snap of twigs, faint but unmistakable. The further I went, the more I felt like something, or someone, was just out of sight, staying a few steps behind. By the time I reached a small clearing to set up camp, the sun had completely vanished. The forest was now bathed in a deep blue, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the sky. I decided to set up my tent quickly, not bothering with much beyond the basics. I didn't want to be out here much longer than I had to. The unease I felt had deepened. I set up my tent, got the campfire going, and tried to relax. But the silence of the night pressed down on me, thick and heavy. The crackle of the fire seemed almost too loud, shattering the stillness. I sat in front of the fire, staring into the flames, willing myself to unwind. But every now and then, I would hear a noise from the trees, a branch cracking, leaves rustling, and it would make me jump. I knew it was likely a nocturnal animal just moving through, but every sound felt amplified in the stillness of the forest. As I sat there, staring into the fire, I heard it again, this time, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush just beyond the treeline. It wasn't a squirrel or deer. It was heavier, slower, and it was too deliberate, almost like it was trying to stay quiet, but wasn't succeeding. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, shining it toward the trees. Nothing, just shadows dancing in the firelight. I felt a deep pit form in my stomach. A bear? My mind raced through all the possibilities, but I didn't want to panic. Couldn't. I had to stay calm. I slowly backed into my tent, unzipping it and stepping inside. The rustling grew louder, closer now. I could hear heavy footsteps crunching in the dry leaves. I kept the flashlight on, pointing it toward the sound, but it was impossible to see much in the darkness of the trees. I felt the weight of the silence press down on me even more. After a few minutes of tense stillness, the sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath, praying that whatever it was would just move on. But then, out of nowhere, I heard something far too close. A loud growl, deep and guttural. My heart skipped a beat. A bear. I scrambled to zip my tent completely, panic rising in my chest. I had read everything about how to handle bears. Make noise, back away slowly, don't run. But there was no way to back away now. I was trapped in this tent, with only a flimsy layer of fabric between me and whatever was out there. The growl came again, this time much closer, and I heard something sniffing the ground just outside the tent. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The ground seemed to tremble beneath me as the creature moved around, no doubt trying to figure out what I was. I reached for my bear spray in the corner of the tent, my hands trembling. I kept my flashlight trained on the tent's opening, just waiting for the shadow of a massive creature to loom over me. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. I didn't dare make a sound. Holding my breath each time, I heard the bear's low growls or the sound of it moving just outside. The smell of the forest seemed thicker now, the air colder as the night deepened. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the noises stopped. No more growling, no more sniffing. I cautiously poked my head out of the tent, keeping the flashlight aimed at the dark forest. There was nothing there. The trees stood silent, their branches still. No sign of the bear. I sat there in the darkness, my breath shallow, the flashlight still shaking in my hand. The hours passed and I did not sleep. I stayed up, wide-eyed, waiting for any sound that would signal the bear's return. But the night passed without another incident. By the time morning came, the sun's rays broke through the canopy, casting a warm, golden light over the forest. I stepped outside the tent, blinking against the brightness. My heart was still racing, but the world seemed calm again. The bear had either moved on or lost interest, but I wasn't taking any chances. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, the fear still lingering in my chest. I stayed alert, looking around, keeping my senses on high alert. I didn't care to stay another night. As I made my way down the mountain trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching me. The woods, for all their beauty, felt alien now. The feeling of being alone had been replaced by a quiet sense of dread. I knew I was lucky to have made it through the night without any major incident. The woods may have seemed peaceful, but they were not as kind as I once thought. I made it back to the trailhead by noon, exhausted and shaken but safe. There was no bear to be seen, no sign of anything dangerous. But as I drove away, the mountains looming behind me in the rearview mirror, I couldn't help but feel a gnawing unease. I had gotten too close to the wilderness this time, and the wilderness had reminded me that, no matter how prepared I thought I was, it always has the upper hand. I had always been drawn to the outdoors, to the quiet, the calm, the rawness of nature. There's something about being far from civilization, out in the middle of nowhere, that always felt like freedom to me. It was the kind of peace I needed after a long stretch of work. No phones, no emails, just the rustling of leaves and the crunch of gravel underfoot. That's why, on a chilly morning in mid-October, I found myself driving through winding roads that cut through dense forests in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd been planning this solo hiking trip for weeks, determined to finally get away from everything. My destination was a less traveled trail, one I'd researched online. It wasn't the busiest, but it wasn't a backcountry trail either. A good place to clear my mind. I was 29 at the time, a bit younger than I'd felt these days, but I wanted to experience the outdoors as much as I could before life started to swallow me whole again. The car ride was uneventful. Just me, the radio, and a few stray thoughts. The drive took longer than I expected, but eventually, I reached the small, dirt parking lot that marked the trailhead. There were only 2 other cars parked there, a silver sedan and a beaten-up pickup truck. No people in sight. Good. I liked the solitude. I checked my gear, backpack, water, snacks, a map, and a flashlight in case it got dark earlier than expected. The sun was still high in the sky, casting warm rays over the hills, but the wind had a bite to it. I put on my jacket and started down the trail. The path was narrow and often blocked by low-hanging branches or twisted roots, but I didn't mind. Every step I took felt like a small victory, a break from the chaos of life. The air was fresh, crisp even, and the smell of pine and damp earth surrounded me. The birds were singing their usual songs, and I heard the occasional scamper of a squirrel or the flutter of wings as something took flight from the underbrush. A couple of times, I stopped to take in the view. The vast expanse of trees stretching on and on, endless hills fading into mist. By mid-afternoon, I had already covered a good portion of the trail. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the ground. The trail wound deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker, the space between them narrower. There was an eerie quiet in the air, and the sounds of animals and birds had faded. I pushed forward, determined to reach the overlook I'd read about, a spot where you could see the whole valley below. I was close, or so I thought. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. The trail, which had been well marked with faded orange blazes on the trees, suddenly became more difficult to follow. The blazes were fewer and farther apart. The path started to split in odd directions, and for the first time I felt a twinge of uncertainty. I checked my map, but it didn't help much. It was one of those old maps that didn't show every little trail, and the marks seemed out of date. I stopped, stood there in the fading sunlight, trying to decide what to do. At first, I thought it might be my own mistake. Maybe I hadn't been paying attention. I decided to backtrack a little, retracing my steps to where I'd last seen a blaze. But as I turned around and headed back, something felt off. I couldn't place it, but the forest felt more oppressive now, heavier. The shadows were longer, and the silence stretched too far. It wasn't the normal quiet of the woods. It felt like a watching silence. I walked for what felt like a half hour, but there was still no sign of the blaze I had seen earlier. I felt an unease growing inside me, a sense that something was wrong. The path wasn't just harder to find, it had become wrong. I was starting to second-guess everything. My map, the trail, the trees themselves. I stopped to take a breath. The wind had picked up, and the sky had shifted to a murky gray, clouds swirling above like they were about to drop a storm. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. I still had plenty of time before it got too dark, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. Something was pulling me off course. I took out my map again, trying to make sense of it. The trail I was on should have been looping back to the main path, but it didn't. It was as if the trail had vanished, like it never existed at all. Panic crept in, but I pushed it down. I couldn't afford to let fear take over. I needed to stay calm, think logically. I began walking faster now, trying to find a clearing or another signpost, anything that could tell me I was going in the right direction. But the more I walked, the more isolated I felt. The air grew heavier, like it was pressing in on me. The trail became more overgrown, the underbrush thickening, the trees closing in as if they were leaning over me. And still, I couldn't find any sign of a proper trail or blaze. Eventually, I reached a small clearing, barely a patch of open space, but a relief nonetheless. I stopped and took a deep breath, looking around. I was lost. I could admit it now. It wasn't a comforting realization, but it was the truth. I was lost in the woods, and I had no idea how to get back. Nightfall was approaching fast, and with it, the temperature began to drop. I set my pack down, took out my water, and tried to think. I knew I couldn't just sit there, not when night would make everything worse. I needed to keep moving, keep looking for a way out. I decided to try retracing my steps again, but this time, I would be more deliberate, marking my path as I went. I used a stick to scratch marks in the dirt and on tree trunks as I went along. The sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time I reached another split in the trail, if you could even call it that. It was more like a barely noticeable path, no more than a series of footmarks in the mud. I followed it, hoping it would lead me somewhere familiar, but as the darkness deepened, my sense of direction became even more unreliable. The trees were so dense now that I couldn't tell which way the trail had gone. My flashlight barely cut through the blackness, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with me. Then I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind or an animal, but when I stopped and listened, I realized it wasn't. There was a sound in the distance, a faint rustling, like something or someone was moving through the underbrush. It wasn't just the wind. I froze, listening harder. The sound stopped and then a crunch, a single step on dry leaves. I wasn't alone. My heart pounded. I stood completely still, barely breathing, straining to hear. Nothing. The rustling had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I scanned the darkness, but saw nothing. My mind raced, jumping to conclusions. Wild animals, people. Who knew? But nothing could prepare me for the next moment. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, and it was close, too close. I didn't wait. I turned and started running, my heart hammering in my chest, my feet tangled in the underbrush, my breathing ragged. I ran blindly through the trees, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand, casting harsh light that made the forest feel like a nightmare. My mind was screaming, telling me to keep going, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. Every step felt heavier. Every shadow felt like a threat. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something following me. The rustling in the trees, the feeling of eyes on my back. It was like the forest itself had turned against me. But eventually I saw it. A flicker of light ahead, faint but real. A cabin, maybe 100 yards away, tucked between the trees. The sight of it made me push harder, my exhaustion forgotten for a moment as I sprinted toward it. I reached the cabin, battered and winded, and pounded on the door. No answer. I tried the handle, and to my relief, it turned. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, and collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. The cabin was old, dusty, and empty. No sign of anyone living there. But for the first time in hours, I felt safe. The sound of whatever had been chasing me had stopped, and the silence felt different, less threatening. As I sat there, trying to calm my breathing, I realized I had been running from something real, something that I couldn't explain. I waited there for what felt like hours, until the adrenaline wore off. The night grew colder, and I knew I had to make it out in the morning. The next day, I would find my way back. I didn't know what had been following me, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back into those woods without a map, a compass, and a much clearer idea of where I was headed. When the sun finally rose the next morning, I made my way back to the trailhead, taking extra care to mark my path along the way. It was a long, slow process, but I eventually found my way back to the car. I wasn't sure what I had encountered, but I knew I'd never forget that night. It wasn't just the fear or the isolation. It was the feeling that sometimes the forest has its own secrets, and maybe just It had been a few years since I last went on a solo hike in the mountains, and I felt like I needed to test myself again. A sense of adventure had been bubbling inside me, but this time, I had chosen a particularly remote trail. The summit was well known, a popular spot in the past, but over the years, the trail had become less traveled. It wasn't on the main hiking maps, which is what made it so appealing. I had a rough idea of where it was, but this was the kind of place where you needed a good sense of direction or a GPS to get through. I was 27 at the time, and I had always enjoyed the outdoors. But something about this hike felt different. Maybe it was the loneliness, or maybe it was the old warning signs I saw online from people saying how the trail had become overgrown. Whatever it was, I couldn't ignore the sense of unease growing in my chest as I packed up my gear that morning. But I brushed it off. I was experienced. Nothing was going to go wrong. The air was crisp that morning, early in the spring, with frost still clinging to the ground despite the sun rising higher. I made my way to the trailhead, where the dirt path was covered with last season's dead leaves. There were no other cars in the parking area, and the silence felt almost heavy. No chatter from other hikers, no signs of anyone coming and going. It was just me. I set off early, about 7 a.m., figuring I'd reach the ridge in a few hours and return by midday. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, not something extreme, but with the way the trail twisted and turned through the dense forest, I quickly lost track of time. The first few hours were uneventful. The path was narrow and overgrown, with trees arching overhead and casting deep shadows on the trail. Birds chirped in the distance, and I could hear the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful, but as I hiked, the weather began to change. The clouds rolled in quickly, turning the bright morning sky to a dull gray. The air grew thicker and the wind picked up. I thought about turning back, but something in me pushed that thought away. I wasn't far in yet, and the ridge wasn't too far off. The thought of quitting never sat well with me. I had come this far, so I pressed on, determined to see it through. I eventually reached a small clearing where the trail split. One path seemed to climb steadily to the right, and the other veered left toward a denser part of the woods. My map was unreliable, so I decided to take the right path, figuring it would lead me toward the summit. I pressed on, my boots crunching on the frost-covered earth, the wind whipping through the trees. It didn't take long for things to feel off. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. The wind stopped, and the only sound was the crunch of my footsteps. I couldn't even hear birds anymore. The sky darkened even more, and I noticed the temperature dropping sharply. I tried to shake the feeling of unease that had settled into my gut. It was nothing, I thought, just a change in the weather, a bad luck patch. But still, my mind raced. Something about this place didn't feel right. I pushed forward, thinking I must be close to the ridge. But after an hour, it seemed like I was no closer. The trail had become harder to follow, with no distinct markings. It was more of a suggestion of a path, winding through thickets of trees and rocky outcrops. The map I had, the one that was supposed to guide me, was increasingly useless. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, I realized I was lost. The trail I had been following vanished altogether, swallowed up by thick brush. I couldn't even remember the last time I saw a clear trail marker. Panic began to settle in, and I tried to steady myself. There was no way I could stay here overnight. I had enough gear, but this was a precarious situation. The temperature had dropped quickly, and the chance of snow had increased. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS, but the screen showed no signal. There was no way to call for help, no way to navigate through the dense woods. I realized just how isolated I was. No one knew where I was, and I hadn't seen another soul all day. I decided to head back in the direction I thought I came from, hoping I could retrace my steps. But after what felt like an hour of wandering through the trees, I realized that I wasn't heading in the right direction at all. The woods were unrecognizable, and I had gone farther than I realized. The panic began to spread. I wasn't prepared for this. My water bottle was half empty, and I was getting hungry. The darkness was closing in, and the chill in the air was more than just uncomfortable now. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could feel the first twinge of frostbite in my fingers. I forced myself to stop, trying to calm my breathing. I couldn't afford to waste energy panicking. I needed to think. I found a large rock at the base of a tree, a place to sit and gather myself. I pulled out my survival kit, checking the contents for anything that could help me. I had enough to survive for a day or two, but not much more. The sun was setting quickly now, and I had to make a decision. I could stay where I was and hope to be found, or I could try to keep moving and find my way back to the trail. I couldn't just sit here. The risk of hypothermia was too high, and I knew I had to move. I decided to keep moving. The dark forest seemed to close in around me as I navigated through the underbrush. I used my flashlight sparingly, not wanting to draw attention, although it was unlikely anyone would be out here this far in. Every noise seemed amplified in the silence. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, making the branches creak and groan. I stumbled on rocks and roots, my legs aching with each step. I had no idea how much time had passed, but I knew I couldn't keep going much longer. My body was exhausted, and the night was colder than before. Finally, after what felt like hours, I spotted something. A flicker of movement too far in the distance to be a person, but something was there. I strained my eyes, my heart skipping a beat. I couldn't tell what it was, but I had to investigate. Could be someone else who had gotten lost, or maybe another hiker who knew the way out. I moved toward it, my steps slower now, careful not to alert whatever it was. The shape in the distance grew clearer, and I recognized the outline of a structure. An old, abandoned cabin. It wasn't much to look at, weather-beaten and covered in overgrowth, but it was shelter. Could be the break I needed. I approached cautiously, checking the area around it. No signs of recent activity, but I still kept my distance as I neared the door. The door was cracked open, and I pushed it gently. It creaked loudly, sending a jolt of tension through my body. Inside, it was dark and damp, but it offered refuge from the freezing cold. I stepped inside, feeling a bit safer now, but still on edge. The cabin was small, with a fireplace, old furniture covered in dust, and the unmistakable smell of mildew. I knew I couldn't stay here for long. There was no food or water, and I needed to find my way out as soon as possible. But for now, it was a temporary relief. As I sat there, trying to gather my thoughts, I realized how lucky I was to have found the cabin. The night grew colder, and the wind outside howled like an animal. But the cabin, though small, kept me sheltered from the worst of the elements. The warmth from the fireplace, even without a fire, gave me a bit of comfort. The next morning, I ventured out again. The storm had passed, and the sun was out, but the snow had started to fall heavily. It was still early, and the day was overcast, but I had no choice but to keep moving. I couldn't afford to waste any more time. I retraced my steps once more, my determination growing stronger as I moved through the now snow-covered forest. Hours passed before I finally stumbled upon another trail marker. Relief flooded through me, and I followed the marker with renewed energy. By the time I reached the main trailhead again, it was well into the afternoon. My legs were sore, my body numb with exhaustion, but I had made it. I had survived the night in the woods. I had found my way back. The moment I reached the parking lot, I saw another hiker heading toward the trailhead. I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, but also a lingering sense of unease. The forest was beautiful but dangerous, and I had learned just how quickly things could go wrong out there. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the mountains in my rearview mirror. I'd made it out, but I knew I'd never forget how close I had come to losing my way forever. The hike had started as a simple adventure, but it had ended with a reminder of just how unforgiving nature could be. The thrill of the unknown had turned into something darker, but I'd walked away with a new respect for the wilderness. I didn't expect much that morning when I decided to hike the trail. I had been hiking around this area for years. The morning was crisp, the kind of cool that made you feel alive. There was a slight breeze that rattled the leaves, and the sun was just starting to make its way over the tree line, casting long shadows that stretched across the dirt path. The kind of perfect weather that gets you in the zone. The trail I was on was one I had hiked a dozen times before. It was nothing special, nothing grand or remote, but it was always a quiet, peaceful walk. I was alone just how I preferred it. Sometimes the sounds of nature are the best company, and that's what I was hoping for today. I started at the base, where the trailhead was marked with a small wooden sign. The sign, worn by time and weather, had faded numbers that only a regular like me would recognize. It was late September, and the trees were starting to show signs of autumn. I put on my backpack, adjusted the straps, and took a deep breath. The first few miles were easy. The path was well traveled, and even though the earth was uneven in places, it wasn't anything too difficult. I had a few miles to go before reaching the halfway point where the trail looped around a small lake. It was supposed to be a peaceful spot to rest, but as I walked, I realized that today felt different. There was something about the stillness that didn't sit right with me. Normally, I would hear the sounds of birds, the occasional rustling of small animals, maybe a squirrel scurrying across the leaves. Today, though, it was dead quiet. The breeze was barely enough to move the trees, and the usual chorus of morning birds was absent. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the time of year. Maybe the animals had already begun migrating, or perhaps they were just staying out of sight. The trail was getting narrower now, the trees thicker, and the underbrush denser. As I moved further along, the trail began to climb slightly, and the view began to open up. I could see the valley below, the layers of green and brown stretching for miles. I stopped at a small clearing to catch my breath. The view was stunning. The wind picked up, shaking the branches of the trees. As I stood there, I noticed something strange. There were no footprints on the trail ahead of me. That was unusual. Normally, the trail was well marked with signs of hikers who had passed through before. But here there was nothing, just untouched earth. The lack of tracks unnerved me more than I cared to admit. Maybe someone had just walked ahead of me, but that thought didn't seem to add up. I continued on, trying to push the nagging feeling to the back of my mind. But as I walked, I noticed more and more that the trail felt off. The trees seemed to grow closer together, the shadows deeper. The path itself felt like it was closing in on me, almost like it was deliberately guiding me in a direction I wasn't sure I wanted to go. By the time I reached the lake, the sky was starting to darken. The sun had moved behind a thick layer of clouds, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. The air was thick with humidity, and a chill crept along my skin. I took a seat on a rock by the water's edge. The lake was still, the surface mirroring the cloudy sky above. It was the perfect place to stop and take in the quiet, but the silence was starting to get to me. No birds, no wind in the trees, just the eerie stillness that was starting to feel unnatural. I glanced at my watch. It was nearing 4 p.m. I had been hiking for several hours now, and I knew the sun would start setting soon. I was about halfway through the loop, and the decision had to be made. I could either turn back and hike out the way I came, or I could continue along the trail and finish the loop, which would take another couple of hours. The idea of turning back sounded more appealing, but I was determined to finish. I had hiked this trail 100 times before, and I wasn't going to let some weird feeling stop me. I packed up my things and stood. The path ahead was darker, and the trees hung over the trail in a way that made it feel even more enclosed. As I walked, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The silence was suffocating, and every footstep seemed too loud. My breath quickened, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more often than I should have. The sun was low in the sky now, and the shadows stretched long across the path. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding as the forest seemed to close in tighter around me. The trail began to slope down, the incline making it more difficult to walk. The underbrush grew thicker, the ground more uneven. Then I saw it, a figure, just ahead of me on the trail. I froze, my blood running cold. It was just standing there, motionless. Couldn't make out any details. The figure was a dark silhouette against the dimming light, but it didn't move. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or maybe a tree stump, but as I stared, the shape became more defined, more human. My heart skipped a beat. I took a step back, then another, and then I started to turn. The feeling of dread in my chest was overwhelming. Something wasn't right. It was too quiet. The air felt thick with tension. I needed to get out of there. I turned and began walking faster. My footsteps echoed through the trees, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if someone was watching me. My breath was coming in shallow gasps as I pushed myself harder down the path. Then I heard it, a rustling noise from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The figure was gone, but the fear didn't dissipate. Instead, it grew. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the earth itself was trying to slow me down. The trail seemed to stretch longer than it ever had before, and no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't escape the sense of being pursued. The wind started to pick up again, but it didn't feel like the same breeze I had felt earlier. This wind was colder, harsher, biting into my skin. The trees groaned and creaked in the wind, their branches swaying in unnatural ways. The trail felt endless now, the landscape around me distorting as I walked. I started running. The fear was overwhelming now. I didn't care about the rocks or the uneven path beneath my feet. I just needed to get to safety. The darkness was closing in, and the shadows felt like they were chasing me, reaching for me. I ran for what felt like hours, until I finally emerged from the woods. The parking lot came into view, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My car was still there, just where I had left it. The familiar sight of it was a relief. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door. I slammed it shut behind me and locked the doors, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't sure what I had seen out there on the trail, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. I'd always enjoyed hiking. There was something about the quiet, open spaces that made me feel free, far from the cluttered noise of everyday life. I'd done plenty of trails over the years, but this one was different. This one was new to me, at least new to my solo hikes. The trail I chose was one of those out-of-the-way places that not many people bothered with. It was located in a rugged part of the Cascade Mountains, miles from the nearest town, and I had heard whispers about how few hikers ever ventured there. Most of the trail was hidden under thick, tangled forests with only a few openings that revealed the breathtaking views of distant peaks. It was late September, just a few days before the official start of fall, and I wanted to experience the crisp air and the changing colors of the trees. I'd seen photos of the leaves turning shades of orange and gold along this trail, and I thought it would be a perfect time to check it out. I packed my bag with the essentials: water, some snacks, a flashlight, my map, and a first aid kit, just in case. The weather report showed clear skies for the day, and I was prepared for a long, quiet hike. I woke up early that morning in my cabin, which was nestled on the outskirts of a small town. The sun had barely started to rise when I pulled on my boots, grabbed my gear, and set off in my truck to the trailhead. It was a long drive, the kind that made you question whether you were heading to a proper trail or just a part of the wilderness where no one had bothered to build a real path. As I drove along the dirt road, the trees crowded in on either side, their branches reaching out like fingers. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the early morning fog clung to the ground. When I finally arrived, the trailhead was marked by a weathered wooden sign that barely stood upright. The trail itself was narrow and overgrown with ferns and brambles, making it difficult to see more than a few steps ahead. It was one of those places where you had to watch your step, being careful not to trip over roots or slip on loose rocks. I adjusted the straps on my backpack and set off, pushing through the foliage and breathing in the fresh mountain air. The first hour of the hike was peaceful. Nothing but the crunch of dirt and gravel underfoot and the occasional chirp of a bird in the distance. I found myself lost in the rhythm of it all, each step taking me further away from the small, safe world I had known. The trail dipped and climbed, weaving its way up the side of a mountain, occasionally opening up to reveal sprawling views of valleys and peaks that seemed to stretch on forever. But as the morning wore on, I started to feel an odd sense of unease. It was subtle at first, just a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. I shook it off. It was probably nothing. Maybe the silence was just getting to me. The farther I went, the less I saw of other hikers, and the more I realized that this trail wasn't as popular as the online guides had suggested. There were no other footprints on the ground except for my own. No signs of life beyond the occasional squirrel darting across the path. Around midday, I reached a part of the trail where the trees opened up into a small clearing, and I decided to take a break. I sat on a large rock, eating some granola bars and taking in the view. The sun had broken through the cloud cover, casting beams of light through the canopy of trees. The warmth was a welcome contrast to the cool mountain breeze. I checked my map, noting that I had already hiked a good distance. The next section of the trail led into a dense forest, where I would eventually reach a small lake before heading back. I packed up my things and began the next part of the hike. The forest was quieter here, the trees more closely packed together. The trail narrowed, and the light grew dimmer as the thick canopy above blocked out much of the sunlight. The air smelled of damp earth and moss. I was alone now, and the quiet was almost oppressive. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig beneath my boots seemed amplified, making me feel as though I wasn't just alone. I was being watched. I kept moving, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The trail curved sharply to the left, and I found myself stepping over a small stream. The water was crystal clear, and I stopped for a moment to take a drink, filling my bottle. It was then that I heard it, a low, distant noise, almost like a crack or a thud. My heart skipped a beat. I stood still, listening intently, but there was nothing else. The forest remained eerily quiet, except for the sounds of my own breathing and the rush of the stream. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or something similar, moving through the brush, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I continued on, my steps quickening. The further I went into the forest, the more the trail became overgrown. There were parts where the vegetation was so thick, I had to push through, and my legs scraped against sharp branches. My nerves were on edge now, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. By mid-afternoon, I reached the lake. It wasn't large, but it was beautiful, surrounded by tall pines, their reflection shimmering in the water. The place was serene, but my stomach churned. I walked along the shore, my thoughts racing. I kept looking around, as if expecting someone to step out from behind the trees. I had been on the trail for hours, and I was alone, totally alone. It was then that I heard it again, the crack of something heavy breaking through the underbrush. This time, it was much closer. My heart raced. I froze, trying to peer into the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, just the faintest shadow darting between the trunks. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing. I didn't want to panic. I told myself I was being paranoid. Could just be an animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The air felt thicker now, suffocating. I decided to turn back. The path I'd come from was still visible, though the thought of retracing my steps made my stomach knot. I had been so certain of the safety of this trail, but something about it felt wrong now. I hurried back, my pace quickening with every step. I wanted to get out of the forest, back to the open trail, back to a place where I could breathe again. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and I could feel the temperature dropping. My mind raced with thoughts. Was I just imagining things? Or was something truly out there, watching me? As I neared the place where I'd stopped for my break earlier, I heard the sound again. A crack, much closer now, as if someone or something was right behind me. My blood ran cold. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. I broke into a full sprint, adrenaline surging through me. I wasn't sure if I was being followed or if I was just in a state of panic, but I couldn't stop. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. I pushed through the dense underbrush, barely able to see the trail anymore, my legs burning from the effort. It felt like an eternity before I finally reached the clearing, the familiar view of the trailhead coming into sight. I stumbled out of the trees, gasping for air, and there it was, my truck, parked where I had left it. I was exhausted, shaken, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The woods behind me were silent, and for the first time in hours, I could breathe easily. I had no explanation for what had happened. I never saw anyone or anything following me, but the feeling of being hunted, of being watched, was so real that I knew it wasn't just in my head. Whatever it was, I had escaped it. I started the engine and drove away, the forest disappearing in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached town, and even then, I could still feel the tension in my body, the knots in my stomach. I told myself that the forest had simply gotten to me, that I had been too far from civilization for too long. But deep down, I knew that the feeling, that cold, unnerving sensation, would stay with me for a long time. The trail might have been beautiful, but I would never go back there again. Some places are better left unexplored. The sun had barely risen when I set off on the trail that morning. I had been waiting for this moment for weeks, finally deciding to take a few days off from work and spend some time in the wilderness. The kind of time that would help me clear my mind and get some distance from the noise of everyday life. I had heard a lot about this trail. Lakeside Ridge, a remote path that wound through dense forests and alongside quiet, pristine lakes. It wasn't well known, which was part of the reason I chose it. I needed solitude. I'm not new to hiking. I'd done it several times before. I was in my late 20s, fit enough to handle a strenuous hike. But even so, I packed carefully. A map, extra food, a flashlight, a few layers of clothing, and a decent amount of water. I wasn't taking any chances. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from the nearest town, and I had to hike for miles before even reaching the first significant landmark. The first few hours were peaceful. The forest was dense, and the early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. Birds chirped in the distance, and the only sound I could hear as I walked was the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots. I was entirely alone, and I appreciated the quiet. But something was off. As I went further into the forest, the sounds around me began to change. The birds' songs grew quieter, and the wind seemed to stop altogether. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. I didn't think much of it at first, attributing it to the stillness of nature. But the longer I walked, the more unsettled I became. There was something strange in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to shake off the feeling. I focused on the path ahead, keeping my mind busy with the beauty of the surroundings. The trees were massive, their trunks thick and gnarled with age, and the ground was soft with moss. The air smelled fresh, like damp earth and pine. It was the kind of place people like to go to get away from it all, and I was supposed to be one of those people. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Around noon, I reached the first lake, its waters still and glassy, reflecting the bright blue sky. I decided to take a short break by the shore, sitting on a rock and taking in the view. I had been hiking for a few hours, and my legs were starting to feel the strain. I pulled out a granola bar and ate slowly, my gaze fixed on the water. It was hard to tell, but it felt like something was moving beneath the surface, small ripples spreading out in perfect circles. The area was so remote that it didn't seem likely anyone else had been around recently, let alone someone who'd have caused those ripples. The water wasn't disturbed by any breeze, so I couldn't explain it. When I stood up to stretch, I felt a chill run through me. I tried to laugh it off, but the air around me had gotten colder, and the sense of being watched crept back in. I couldn't shake it, even as I packed up and began walking again. The next leg of the trail was supposed to take me deeper into the woods, and I was looking forward to reaching a small campsite near a second, more secluded lake before nightfall. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that someone was nearby. I glanced over my shoulder once or twice, but there was nothing. The forest grew denser the further I went, the trees crowding closer together, their branches intertwining like twisted fingers. The trail narrowed, and soon I was walking along a ridge, the drop on either side steep and dangerous. I couldn't hear the birds anymore, only the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. I wasn't scared, exactly, but my nerves were on edge. Every time I heard a crack in the woods, I froze, waiting for something, or someone, to emerge. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like everything had stopped moving just for me. The kind of silence you feel in your bones. By late afternoon, the sky began to darken. I didn't want to be caught in the woods when it got too dark to see, so I pushed forward, hoping to reach the campsite soon. But the path had changed. It was more overgrown now, the trail almost completely hidden beneath thick vegetation. Seemed wrong, as if the trail wasn't supposed to be this way. I paused and checked my map, but it didn't make sense. According to my map, this part of the trail was supposed to be clear, but it was anything but. I kept walking, but my pace had slowed, and the sense of unease was growing stronger. The trees seemed to loom over me now, blocking out more and more of the sky. The wind had started up again, but it was erratic, coming in gusts that whipped through the branches, making the trees creak and groan. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was just out of sight, watching me. It wasn't until I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me that my heart really started to race. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint but clear, slow, deliberate footsteps, just a few paces behind me. I turned around quickly, but the trail was empty. My mind raced. There was no one. I was alone, but the sound had been unmistakable. Someone was back there. I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't ignore it. I quickened my pace, my footsteps heavy and fast on the uneven ground. Every few moments, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but every time, the trail remained empty. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the pounding of my own heart. I kept walking, my breath coming in short, quick bursts, until I saw the clearing ahead. The campsite wasn't far now. Just when I thought I might be in the clear, the footsteps started again, only this time they were faster, closer. Panic set in, and I broke into a full sprint, not caring about the branches and roots that tripped me up. The campsite was just ahead. I could see the outline of the tent and the small fire ring where I had planned to camp. I burst into the clearing, my legs burning, and skidded to a stop. I was gasping for air, my heart thudding painfully in my chest, but there was no one there. I quickly dropped my pack and scanned the trees around me, half expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows. The footsteps had stopped. The sun was beginning to set now, the last of the light filtering through the trees. I was shaking, exhausted from the adrenaline, and I quickly set up my tent. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had happened. I hadn't imagined those footsteps, but I was the only one here. No one else could have been on the trail with me. Could it have been an animal? A deer? Maybe, but that didn't explain the way the steps had matched mine so precisely. I tried to settle down, telling myself it was nothing, just a trick of the mind. But every crack of a twig, every gust of wind, sent my heart racing again. I was on edge the entire evening, jumping at the smallest noise. By nightfall, I had a fire going. I cooked my dinner as quickly as I could, barely tasting it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was watching me. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows on the trees around me. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, but the quiet seemed unnatural. The world felt off, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't sleep much that night, lying awake in my tent, listening to every sound outside. The night passed slowly, but I was still there in the morning, alive and unscathed. The next day, I packed up my things and left the campsite early, my mind still reeling from what I had experienced. The trail back to the parking lot was a blur. I didn't even want to look back to see if anyone or anything was following me. By the time I reached the car, the sense of unease was still with me, lingering like a shadow, but I was relieved to leave the trail behind. As I drove away, I couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the side of the road, watching me drive off. But there was no one there, just the empty, silent woods. I never went back to Lakeside Ridge. I had always been the type of person who needed to get away from the constant noise of everyday life. City traffic, work deadlines, and social media, it all felt overwhelming at times. So when I found an old hiking trail online, one that seemed untouched, barely known to the public, I jumped at the opportunity. It was a remote spot in the Cascade Range, near the Oregon-Washington border. It was the perfect place to spend a long weekend, alone with my thoughts, deep in nature. The year was 2023. I was 29 years old, an office worker who spent most of my days glued to a computer screen. I had been hiking a few times before, but this would be my first solo trip. At first, it seemed like an adventurous idea, getting lost in the woods with nothing but the sound of birds, wind, and my own footsteps to keep me company. But as I would later find out, this would turn into something far different than I ever anticipated. I set out on a Friday morning, the sun just rising as I drove to the trailhead. The area was about 2 hours away from Portland, Oregon, so I made sure to leave early. I had packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, and my trusted hiking boots. The weather was perfect, clear skies, with a chill in the air that promised to warm up as the day went on. I felt excited, eager even, as I neared the trailhead. The sign at the entrance was weathered, its edges faded from years of exposure. There wasn't much in the way of any real information, just the trail name, Lost Creek Loop, with a simple map on a nearby post. The loop was supposed to be about 12 miles, which seemed manageable for a weekend getaway. A small parking lot was nearby, with only one other car parked there. It seemed quiet, peaceful, and isolated. A good sign, I thought. I grabbed my backpack and started down the trail, following the well-worn path as it dipped into the woods. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me, their branches intertwining to create a canopy of leaves. The ground was soft beneath my feet, covered in pine needles and the occasional patch of moss. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and cool, like the kind of air you can only find deep in the woods. As I walked, I felt a growing sense of calm wash over me. The stresses of daily life seemed to melt away with every step. Birds chirped overhead, and the only sounds I could hear were the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. There was a small creek to my left, its water babbling over rocks, adding to the serene atmosphere. I was in my element, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like everything was right. Hours passed, and I made my way deeper into the forest. The trail had begun to wind upwards, becoming steeper as it climbed toward a ridge. I stopped for a break at a small clearing, sitting on a rock to catch my breath and drink some water. The view from here was incredible: rolling hills, dense trees, and far in the distance, the jagged peaks of the Cascade Range. It was the kind of view that made all the effort worth it. I checked my map. The loop wasn't complicated, and I was on the right path. The trail continued up to the ridge and then looped back around, eventually leading me to a small campsite by another creek. It seemed like a perfect spot to spend the night, so I decided I'd push on and reach it by evening. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It was a strange feeling, knowing that I was so far from civilization. I was isolated, but not in a bad way. I had my food, my tent, and everything I needed. What could go wrong? But then, I started to notice something strange. The air grew colder as I ascended the ridge. Not just a normal drop in temperature, but a sudden, unnatural chill that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just the cold either. There was an unsettling silence around me, like the forest had just gone. Still, the birds stopped singing, and the wind seemed to have died down. It was eerie, but I brushed it off as a normal part of being deep in the woods. I pressed on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was as if the forest itself was watching me, the trees like silent sentinels. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but the sense of unease continued to grow. As I rounded a corner in the trail, something caught my eye. A large rock formation jutted out from the side of the ridge, partially covered by thick brush. Something about it looked out of place. It didn't belong, not in the way the natural rock formations did. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to check it out. I pushed through the undergrowth, making my way to the rocks. There, in a small alcove, was something I had not expected to find. A rusted metal object half buried in the dirt. It looked like an old canister of some kind, possibly a food storage container from an old campsite. I crouched down to inspect it further. There were no markings, just the faded metal and the heavy rust. But something about it, something didn't feel right. I stood up quickly, brushing my hands off. That's when I noticed it. The ground around me was disturbed. Dirt kicked up, branches broken. It looked like someone or something had been here recently. I felt my stomach tighten. I had been hearing about the dangers of hiking alone. The stories of hikers who wandered off trail or found themselves in situations they couldn't escape from. But I never thought much of it. Not until now. I decided to continue on, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I was almost to my campsite, but the strange feeling stayed with me, lingering as the shadows grew longer. By the time I reached the campsite, dusk had settled in. I hurried to set up my tent, the chill of the air making me move faster than I normally would. The creek beside the campsite babbled peacefully, its sound almost soothing. I told myself everything was fine. I was just overthinking things. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was ridiculous, I knew that. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. Still, I kept the zipper of the tent partially open, just enough so I could hear anything moving outside. I must have drifted off at some point, but I woke up in the middle of the night. A noise had disturbed me, a rustling sound from outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal, but it didn't sound right. The rustling was too deliberate, too close. I lay there, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound came again, followed by a low thud, like something heavy had dropped to the ground. I was frozen, my mind racing. Could it be someone else out here? But I was alone, right? I didn't hear another car at the trailhead. There was no one else on the trail. Another thud. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the tent flap, shining it out into the dark. Nothing. The rustling had stopped. The only sound was the water flowing in the creek. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I had to stay calm. Could be nothing. Could just be an animal. But the rational part of my brain didn't seem to have a hold on me anymore. I lay back down, holding my breath, waiting. Every noise outside the tent now seemed amplified, distorted in the silence of the woods. The feeling of being watched had returned in full force. I must have fallen asleep again, though I don't remember when. I woke up the next morning to the sound of birds chirping, the sunlight filtering through the trees, and the cool morning air. The campsite was calm, peaceful even. The strange events of the night felt like a distant memory, something that didn't make sense anymore. I packed up my things, eager to leave the campsite behind. As I started to head back toward the trail, I noticed something odd. There were tracks leading off the path, a set of footprints, large and deep, as if someone or something had walked right up to my tent in the night. I froze. The tracks were fresh, too fresh to have been there the night before. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone at all. It was a quiet morning when I decided to go on that hike. The sun had just started rising, casting a golden glow over the mountainside. I was alone as usual. Sometimes, being by myself was the only time I could truly clear my head, and the mountains had a way of calming the chaos inside me. I had been up to the Smoky Ridge a few times before, but this time I was going to try an off-the-beaten-path trail I'd read about on a hiking forum. The map wasn't detailed, but I figured I could handle it. I was 32, experienced with the outdoors, and had done plenty of solo trips. I felt confident. I packed my gear the night before: water, a few protein bars, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a compass. My backpack felt light, which I liked. I wasn't planning on going too far, just a few miles. The trail was supposed to be short but steep. I'd be back by noon. The air was cool and crisp when I set out. The early morning mist was still clinging to the trees, and the ground was soft from the dew. Birds were waking up, their calls echoing through the woods. The dirt path was narrow, lined with thick trees that loomed overhead like silent giants. Their branches twisted together above me, creating a canopy that shielded the sun from fully breaking through. The ground was wet in spots, the earth giving way slightly underfoot as I walked. I hadn't seen another hiker all morning. There were no voices, no sounds of people in the distance. just the natural sounds of the forest. That's what I loved about it. I was alone with the wilderness, disconnected from everything else. As I moved further along the path, the trees grew denser and the trail less defined. I had to stop a couple of times to double-check the map, but the trail was mostly clear. It wasn't long before I came to a small stream, its water rushing over rocks. The trail continued on the other side, but I had to cross over to stay on track. I carefully navigated the stream, using the rocks to keep my feet dry. But as I stepped on one of the rocks, I slipped slightly, losing my balance for a second. My heart raced for a moment, but I quickly regained my footing and continued onward, shaking off the brief panic. The trail began to rise sharply, the terrain growing steeper as I climbed. The trees were thinning out now, replaced by thick bushes and tall grass. I could feel the climb in my legs, but I welcomed it. The higher I went, the more isolated I felt. No one else was around. Not that I minded. The air was thinner up here, and the trees were starting to look more twisted, their bark dark and rough. It was almost as though they were ancient guardians of the ridge, standing watch over something. It was around midday when I reached the top of the first ridge. From there, the view was stunning. The valley below me stretched for miles, a sea of green with tiny winding roads and fields dotted here and there. The distant mountains rose in jagged peaks, their snow-capped tops glistening under the sun. I stood there for a while, just taking it all in. There's something about seeing the world from a height like that. It makes you feel small, but at the same time, it gives you a strange sense of peace. I sat down to rest for a while, munching on a protein bar and taking a drink from my water bottle. My thoughts drifted to my life back in town, the usual routine. Work, family, the obligations that come with being an adult. Out here, none of that mattered. Here, it was just me and the land, and I felt at home in a way I didn't anywhere else. But as the wind began to pick up, I started to feel a shift. It wasn't anything tangible at first, just a feeling in the air. The wind was cold, biting at my skin, and the clouds had begun to gather on the horizon. I checked the weather app on my phone, but there wasn't any indication of rain. Still, the change in the air was unsettling. I decided it was time to head back, but as I turned to retrace my steps, I realized something. The path I had taken up was no longer visible. The trees, the bushes, they were all starting to look the same. I walked around in circles for a while, trying to spot the faint trail I had followed, but nothing seemed familiar. Panic started to creep in, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. I had done this hike countless times before. How could I have gotten lost? I pulled out my compass and tried to orient myself. The needle swung wildly, unable to settle. That was when I realized I had wandered off the trail. I couldn't pinpoint when it had happened, but it was clear that I wasn't on the path I had followed earlier. The sky had grown darker as the wind continued to howl. I had no choice but to keep moving, hoping I could find a way down before it got too late. But the terrain wasn't making it easy. The bushes were thick, and the ground was uneven. It felt like I was trudging through an endless maze. I kept my eyes peeled for anything familiar, but every turn I took led me deeper into unfamiliar territory. Hours passed, and the daylight began to fade. My headlamp was in my bag, but I didn't want to use it unless I absolutely had to. I had heard stories of people getting disoriented by their own lights in the dark, and I didn't want to risk making the situation worse. At some point, I stopped to rest. My legs were sore, and my stomach had begun to growl. I had eaten all the food I'd packed, and I realized I had underestimated how much water I'd need. It wasn't a good situation, and I knew it, but I couldn't let fear take over. I had to think clearly. I decided to try and head down the mountain the way I thought I came up. It was a risk, but I didn't see any other choice. The last thing I wanted was to stay out here overnight. I had no shelter, and the weather was only getting worse. The sky was now dark gray, with occasional flashes of lightning in the distance. I began descending, carefully picking my way down the mountain. The ground was rocky, and the path was barely visible, but I could feel the slope of the land, and it seemed to be going in the right direction. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every sound in the forest seemed amplified. The wind rustled the trees, and I could hear branches snapping somewhere in the distance. I was starting to lose hope when I finally stumbled upon something familiar, a large rock outcrop that I remembered passing earlier that day. Relief flooded over me. I was close. I had made it. The rest of the hike was a blur. I followed the rock outcrop down the slope and eventually found the familiar stream I had crossed earlier. From there, it was just a matter of retracing my steps back to the trailhead. The storm was closing in, but I wasn't going to stop now. The thought of being out in the open during a thunderstorm made my skin crawl, but I pushed through the discomfort. By the time I reached the base of the mountain, the rain had started to fall, heavy and relentless. I was soaked to the bone, but I didn't care. I had made it. It was nearly dark by the time I reached my car, my legs aching, my body exhausted, but my mind was at peace. The storm raged behind me, but I had made it through. I had been alone out there, but I had kept calm, kept focused, and found my way back. I wasn't sure what had happened out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I'd never take my safety for granted again. It was the kind of hike that I had done dozens of times before, yet something about this particular day felt different. The sun was just starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trail. I had chosen this hike because it was supposed to be peaceful, secluded, perfect for some time away from the world. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day, which wasn't unusual, given the more remote nature of this part of the park. But still, a nagging feeling lingered at the back of my mind, one I couldn't shake. It was late September, and the weather had been perfect for a hike. The air was crisp, and the trees were starting to change their colors, a mix of golds and reds. The trail was quiet, only the sound of my boots crunching over fallen leaves. I loved the solitude, and I figured I'd spend the night out there before returning in the morning. The plan was simple: set up camp near the creek, have a little fire, and enjoy the peace of nature. By the time I reached the creek, the light was almost gone. The fading sunlight made the water look like liquid glass, the perfect spot to settle for the night. I pulled out my camping gear, tent, sleeping bag, and stove, and got to work. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the woods themselves. The place was beautiful and calming, but it was the silence, the oppressive kind that sits on your chest when everything around you feels too still. After I set up camp and started a fire, I sat back on a rock by the creek, watching the flames dance. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, and it had a way of calming my nerves. I let the warmth from the fire spread across my face, the crackling and popping almost like a conversation. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring into the flames. But when I looked up, I noticed something. The trail was clearly visible from where I sat, winding its way through the trees. I could see the outline of the path, but there was something moving there, a dark figure, just a blur at first, but it was definitely moving. My first thought was that it might be another hiker, but there was something strange about the way it moved. It wasn't the natural stride of someone walking or hiking. It was more erratic, as though the figure was stumbling, lost, or perhaps even injured. I stood up, uneasy, unsure of what to do. My instinct was to call out, but something told me not to. I had no real reason to feel this way. Maybe I had been on edge from the isolation, but everything in me was telling me that I shouldn't approach. Instead, I quietly grabbed my flashlight, aimed it at the figure, and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness like a knife, and for a brief moment, the figure froze. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then the figure took off, running. I felt a rush of adrenaline, and for a second, I thought about chasing after them, but something stopped me. The last thing I wanted was to be out in the dark, alone in the woods at night. My heart was racing now, and all I wanted to do was go inside my tent and forget this moment. I didn't think about it much more that night, but the unease never fully left me. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind rustle the trees above. The creek gurgled softly nearby, but in the distance, I could hear something else, something faint but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. It wasn't a normal noise. Not the kind of footsteps you hear from animals like deer or squirrels, but heavy, deliberate, like someone walking in boots. I froze, not sure if I was just hearing things or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The footsteps came closer, crunching over the leaves on the ground. They were too loud to be just a passing animal, but not consistent enough to be another hiker. I held my breath, straining to listen, but all I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. Absolute silence returned, but now the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, prickling with the uneasy feeling of being watched. I grabbed my flashlight, clicking it on and off, hoping to catch any movement. But nothing, not a single sound. I had told myself I'd stay calm, but the longer I stayed out there, the more convinced I became that something wasn't right. Maybe I was overthinking it, but the footsteps, the figure from earlier, kept replaying in my mind. Who would be out here this far in the middle of the night? I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to the sounds around me, never quite able to shake the feeling of being watched. Morning came with the pale light of dawn, but even as I packed up my camp and prepared to head out, the unease lingered like a shadow. I hiked out of the area, trying to shake off the strange events of the night before. The entire morning was peaceful, with no signs of anything unusual. The sun rose higher, bringing with it a warmth that was more reassuring than I'd expected. The path was familiar now, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze seemed calming. But then, just as I neared the end of the trail, I noticed something odd. There, right by the trailhead, was my backpack. It had been left there, just off the path, not far from the spot where I had first noticed the figure the night before. I paused, feeling my heart skip a beat. I was certain I hadn't left it there. I had packed up and moved down the trail without it being out of place. Someone had to have placed it there. But why? I approached cautiously, making sure to check the area around me. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no movement. I bent down to grab my bag, and that's when I saw it. A small, faded scrap of paper wedged into the zipper. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. On the paper was a simple, yet chilling message: "Don't go back." I stood there, staring at the note, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, thinking through every possible explanation. But deep down, I knew I wasn't going to stick around to figure it out. I turned and left the area quickly, walking as fast as I could, without looking back. Every step felt like it took me further away from whatever had happened out there, and I didn't want to risk staying another minute. The hike that had begun as a peaceful retreat ended up being a strange and unsettling experience. As I made my way to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me all along, waiting for me to leave. But now, as I looked back, I was glad to be away from that spot. Some parts of nature are better left unexplored. It was early October when I decided to go on a solo hike in the Appalachians. I'd been planning this trip for months, determined to push myself to the limit, escape the hustle of daily life, and embrace the silence of nature. The weather had been perfect leading up to my trip, with clear skies and cool temperatures, making it the ideal time for hiking. I was in my late 20s, used to long outdoor treks, but this one was going to be different. It wasn't the trail that worried me. It was the solitude. I had done a fair amount of research, picking a remote trail that spanned a good distance and promised to test my endurance. It was a loop that ran for about 15 miles, winding through dense forests, past rushing streams, and up to a lookout where you could see for miles. The kind of place where you could lose yourself both physically and mentally. Perfect for a break from the routine. I packed my gear the night before, making sure everything was in order. A sleeping bag, a tent, a few days worth of food, water, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. Nothing too extravagant, just enough to survive for a few days in the woods. I set out early that morning, arriving at the trailhead as the sun was rising. The light was just starting to peek over the horizon, and the world was still calm, almost as if it was waiting for something. I tightened my boots, adjusted my backpack, and began walking. The first few hours went smoothly. The trail was well marked, and I was able to find my rhythm, settling into the comforting sounds of crunching leaves beneath my boots and the occasional chirp of birds in the trees. I didn't see anyone else for the entire morning, and it was a relief. There's something about being alone in the wilderness, away from the noise of the city, that makes everything feel clearer, more peaceful. But as the day wore on, things started to change. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature slowly rose. By midday, I had moved deeper into the forest, the trees becoming thicker and the trail narrower. I had begun to feel a slight unease, though I couldn't place why. It wasn't anything in particular, just a vague feeling that something was off. The sounds of the forest seemed to change. The birds had gone quiet, and there was an odd stillness to the air. I paused at a stream to refill my water bottle, trying to shake the feeling. I continued on, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. The trail led up a series of steep inclines, forcing me to stop frequently to catch my breath. Sweat trickled down my face, and my legs started to ache, but I kept pushing forward. I knew there was a campsite a few miles ahead, and I was determined to reach it by the time the sun started to dip below the treeline. But then, something unexpected happened. As I was climbing a particularly steep slope, I heard something behind me, a rustling in the brush, soft at first, like an animal moving through the undergrowth. I froze, listening. The sound was unmistakable. Something or someone was there. I turned around, expecting to see a deer or some other wildlife, but there was nothing. The woods were silent again, except for the faint breeze rustling the leaves. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the wind or perhaps a squirrel or a fox. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my breath came a little faster. I pushed on, my pace quickening. The trail had started to get rockier, and the trees grew taller and more densely packed. The further I went, the more I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I couldn't escape the thought that something was out there, waiting. As the hours passed, the sun dipped lower in the sky, and the light started to fade. I checked my map, realizing I had only made it halfway to the campsite. I was starting to get tired, and my legs ached more than I expected. It would be dark soon, and I didn't want to be caught on the trail after dark. I needed to make it to the campsite, and I needed to do it fast. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw something up ahead, a faint light. It wasn't the glow of a campfire, but rather a strange flicker, almost like a reflection. My first thought was that it might be someone else, another hiker who had made it to the site early. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief at the thought of company. But as I drew closer, the light didn't get any brighter. It remained small, flickering weakly. I reached the clearing where the light was coming from and found nothing. No fire, no hiker, just a small pool of water, reflecting the dimming sky. Confused and now thoroughly unsettled, I turned to leave, but that's when I heard it again. The sound of rustling in the woods. Only this time it was closer, much closer. I froze. The sound wasn't coming from the trees behind me, like before. It was coming from the direction of the trail ahead. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. I couldn't shake it, couldn't ignore it any longer. I quickly turned and made my way back toward the main trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest felt unnaturally still, as if it was holding its breath. The air was thick with tension, and every little noise, every snap of a twig, every rustle of the underbrush, felt like it was happening right behind me. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. The daylight was quickly fading, and the thought of being stuck in the woods at night was starting to terrify me. I needed to find that campsite. It was the only place I felt I could be safe. Just as I was about to give up hope, I saw a faint glow through the trees. It wasn't the same strange flicker as before, but a steady, reassuring light. My campsite. I hurried toward it, adrenaline pushing me forward. I finally reached the clearing where the site was located, only to find that the light I had seen was not from a campfire. It was from my own flashlight, lying in the dirt near the fire ring. The flashlight had been on, but there was no sign of anyone. No tent, no backpack, no gear. My heart sank as I realized I wasn't alone. Someone had been here, but they weren't here now. I quickly scanned the area, my mind racing. I had been so focused on reaching this point that I hadn't thought about what was around me. The shadows were growing longer, and the woods felt alive with something I couldn't name. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get out of the area before whoever or whatever had been here earlier came back. I grabbed my gear and began to back away from the site, my eyes constantly flicking to the tree line, looking for movement. The rustling sounds I had heard earlier seemed to echo in my ears, growing louder the further I went. With my heart racing, I sprinted down the trail. I didn't know what was out there, but I didn't want to find out. The woods, which had once seemed peaceful and beautiful, now felt menacing, like a trap closing in around me. I ran for what felt like miles, not stopping until the trees finally began to thin, and I saw the faint glow of distant streetlights. When I reached the parking lot at the trailhead, I didn't stop to look back. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and drove away without a second thought. I never did figure out what happened that day. I didn't go back to the trail, and I never spoke to anyone about it. But the image of that campsite, the strange flickering light, and the feeling of being watched, those stayed with me. Every time I go into the woods now, that sense of unease follows me, lurking at the edge of my awareness, just waiting for me to slip up. And maybe that's the most terrifying part. Not knowing what was out there in the woods, watching me, waiting for the right moment. I can certainly craft a detailed, realistic, and extended first-person perspective hiking story for you. However, since the story you're asking for is very long and specific in terms of word count, 7,000 plus words, it may take some time for me to generate it properly in one go. Due to character limitations, I might need to break the story into several parts. I'll start creating the story now, focusing on making it as immersive, detailed, and realistic as possible. I'll make sure the scenario involves an intense hiking experience, with no supernatural elements, just real threats or dangers. I'll also provide a clear, fulfilling ending. Let's get started. Please hold on while I begin. It was a late summer afternoon, around the middle of August in 2019, when I decided to take a solo hike through the Cascades. I'd been eyeing this trail for months, but I never got around to it. The idea of trekking alone through one of the quieter areas of the range seemed thrilling to me. The trail was marked as a difficult one, about a 20-mile round trip with significant elevation gain. I'd hiked longer distances before, but this one felt different. I'd seen the occasional photos online of hikers who made it to the top. The summit views were jaw-dropping. This wasn't a trail that saw a lot of foot traffic, and that was exactly what I wanted. Peace and solitude. I was 27, in good shape, and thought I had prepared as well as I could for the trek. I had a backpack with a few essentials: water, a few protein bars, a first aid kit, a compact tent, and some extra layers in case the weather took a turn. I didn't need much, just enough to get me through the night. The route would take me through dense forests, along ridgelines, and offer glimpses of deep valleys below. I had seen maps and read other hikers' reports, and it seemed manageable. There were occasional warnings about wildlife, but nothing I hadn't encountered before, just bears and the occasional cougar. The first few hours were easy. The trail was well marked, winding gently through thick conifers. I kept to a steady pace, listening to the crunch of dirt and fallen leaves underfoot. The air smelled fresh, earthy, nothing but the occasional breeze rustling through the treetops. Birds chirped around me, and I could hear the distant sound of a creek as I made my way deeper into the forest. There was no one else on the trail, just me and the quiet. It wasn't until I hit the halfway point that things started to feel off. It wasn't anything particular at first. I stopped for a quick break, perched on a boulder by a small stream. As I pulled out a protein bar and took a drink of water, I realized that the forest had become noticeably quieter. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind seemed to have died down. It was unsettling in an odd way, like I was being watched. I shook it off, just nerves, I told myself. I wasn't used to hiking in such isolation. I continued onward, and soon the trail began to climb steeper. the trees thinning out and giving way to rockier ground. I knew I was getting close to the more difficult portion of the hike. I had been planning to camp somewhere near the top of the ridge, and as the trail started to level out, I figured this would be a good spot to stop for the night. I found a decent patch of flat ground just off the trail. There was a rocky outcrop to one side and a small clearing with some sparse grass. I set up my tent quickly, just as the sun started to dip behind the mountains. The light was fading fast, and soon it would be dark. I made a small campfire, just enough to cook a simple meal. As I sat by the fire, the quiet seemed to settle deeper. It was so still, so eerily calm. The crackling of the fire was the only sound breaking the silence. As I ate, my mind wandered to the things I had read online. Warnings about mountain lions, the occasional bear sighting, and even more unsettling, reports of people going missing in the Cascades. It wasn't that I was worried, but the stories lingered in the back of my mind. I'd read that it was important to be cautious at night. Animals were more active, and I knew that without the constant noise of the forest, there was a real risk of not hearing something approach. I made sure my food was packed away tightly, and I kept my bear spray close by. The first few hours of darkness were peaceful. The air grew colder, and I zipped up my jacket. The fire began to burn down to embers, and I decided it was time to head to the tent. It was around 9 p.m., and I was tired from the day's hike. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind picking up outside, but I felt at ease. It wasn't until around midnight that I woke to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind shaking the trees or maybe a small animal scurrying by. But then I heard it again, something larger. It wasn't the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. It was deliberate, heavy, and too close for comfort. My heart rate quickened. I lay perfectly still, straining to listen, hoping whatever it was would pass by. The sounds came again, closer this time. Something large was circling the camp, just outside the edge of my tent. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it a bear? A cougar? Could have been anything. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping. My heart skipped. I couldn't be sure, but it felt like the sound was intentional, like whatever was out there was trying to get a better look at me. I reached for my headlamp and turned it on, shining the beam toward the entrance of the tent. My hands were shaking slightly, but I tried to stay calm. I wasn't entirely sure what to do. I had no clear line of sight. There was a small clearing in front of me, but the trees blocked most of the view. And then, through the thin fabric of the tent, I saw a shadow move. It was large, too large for anything small like a raccoon or a deer. I grabbed my bear spray, my mind racing through what I knew about handling a potential bear encounter. I reminded myself to stay calm. Bears were unpredictable, especially at night. I knew I had to be ready in case it decided to approach further. The shadow lingered for what felt like forever, and I could hear it moving around. The quiet was gone now, replaced by the sound of whatever was out there slowly circling. My breathing was loud in my ears, and I realized how vulnerable I felt. I was alone. After what felt like hours, the shadow faded, the movement slowly drifting off into the distance. I kept the light on the entrance, trying to catch any movement, but nothing happened. It was just stillness. The sound stopped, and for a while, the only noise was the wind rustling in the trees. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, alert, and constantly listening. I didn't sleep at all, too scared to close my eyes. It wasn't until first light when I finally saw the full scope of what had happened. I stepped out of my tent and saw the unmistakable signs of large footprints around the clearing. Too large to be from a deer or even a bear. They were human, barefoot human prints, deep in the dirt. Panic set in. My thoughts raced. Had someone been out there the entire time, watching me? I had no way of knowing. The prints weren't fresh. Whoever had left them had been gone for a while. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still out there. I packed up as quickly as I could, my movements frantic. I needed to get out. I decided to cut the hike short, and I headed back down the trail. Every noise sent me into a frenzy. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made my heart race. I half expected to see someone step out from behind a tree at any moment. I was only about 2 miles from the trailhead when I heard something that froze me in place. There was no mistaking it. Footsteps. Someone was walking behind me. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't dare look back. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the steps were getting closer. Finally, I turned a corner on the trail, and there, at the edge of the clearing, I saw him. A man standing just inside the trees. He was watching me, unmoving. My stomach dropped. He was barefoot, his clothes ragged and dirty, his eyes wide and wild. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted the last mile to the trailhead, my breath ragged, my muscles screaming in protest. When I reached my car, I didn't look back. I drove straight to the nearest town and called the authorities. Turns out, the man was a local who had been living off the grid for years. He had a history of mental health issues and had been known to approach hikers, though he had never been violent. I was lucky, but the terror of that night stayed with me. I've never gone hiking alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. In the end, I made it out safely. The experience taught me just how unpredictable the wilderness can be, how alone you can feel when you're deep in the forest, and how important it is to always stay vigilant, no matter how prepared you think you are. It was early September when I decided to head into the mountains for a solo hiking trip. I was 28, a nature enthusiast, and had done enough solo hikes to know my way around trails and backwoods. This time, I had picked a stretch of the Rocky Mountains, somewhere remote just outside of Boulder. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. It wasn't that I didn't trust my friends, but I liked the solitude. Plus, if I came back safe, I could tell them all about it. The weather was perfect as I drove to the trailhead that morning. The crispness in the air was familiar, the kind of coolness you only get in the mountains. The sky was a vibrant blue with not a cloud in sight. The kind of day where everything just felt right. I packed light but made sure I had all the essentials: water, food, a first aid kit, map, compass, flashlight, and a few layers of clothing. It was supposed to be a one-day hike, but I wasn't in any rush. The trail was quiet as I expected. Most people choose more popular routes, but this particular path, just past a small ridge, wasn't as frequented. I liked that about it. It was secluded enough for peace, but it also meant I wouldn't see anyone for hours. The first couple of hours were uneventful. I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the sharp sense of pine and the earthy smell of damp moss as I made my way through the forest. The trail itself was narrow, winding through thick trees with the occasional break in the woods where I could see sweeping views of the valley below. At one point, I stopped to take a sip of water and noticed some small animal tracks in the mud. A deer? Maybe? A mountain lion could have been nearby too, though I didn't see anything that looked particularly fresh. I paused to enjoy the view for a while, the mountain ridges stretching far into the distance. There was something calming about it, something that helped clear the clutter in my mind. But that peace was soon broken by a distant sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the wind, but then it became clearer, like something large moving through the brush, cracking twigs under heavy weight. I froze. At first, I thought it might be a bear. I'd seen black bears before in these mountains, and they could be curious but usually kept their distance. I quietly stepped off the trail and into a thicket, trying to remain as still as possible. The sound grew louder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Whatever it was close. Too close. I couldn't see anything, but the noise was unmistakable. It wasn't just a bear. It sounded too deliberate, too purposeful. I stood motionless, my heart hammering in my chest. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The noise didn't come closer, but it didn't fade either. I wasn't sure what to do. My instincts told me to stay put and wait, but my gut told me this wasn't just some curious animal. I had heard about hikers encountering more dangerous situations, and though I wasn't exactly panicking, something about the whole situation felt off. Then, just when I was starting to second-guess myself, the sound stopped. The quiet was deafening after that. For several moments, there was no sound at all. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves. My mind was racing. I decided to make my way back to the trail and continue on, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. As I moved forward, I noticed the trail started to get steeper, the trees thinning out, and the rockier terrain making the hike a bit more challenging. I was now in a section of the mountains where the forest gave way to rocky outcroppings, with an almost sheer drop to one side. It wasn't dangerous if you were careful, but I wasn't looking to take any risks. I found myself glancing behind me every so often, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows of the trees. Hours passed, and I reached a plateau where I decided to take another break. I unpacked a small snack of trail mix and jerky, trying to focus on the view rather than the strange feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. As I ate, I looked around, nothing unusual. The mountains stretched out in all directions, and for a moment, I felt foolish for being so jumpy. It wasn't until I was about to finish my snack that I heard it again. The sound of something moving in the distance. This time, it wasn't just in the brush. It was loud, like footsteps crunching on the gravel of the trail, but not from the direction I'd been traveling. No one had passed me earlier, and the trail was too narrow for anyone to have gotten ahead of me. I looked over my shoulder, scanning the landscape. Nothing, but that same feeling from before crept back up again. A feeling that I wasn't alone. At this point, I debated turning back. I had originally planned to go deeper into the mountain range, but something about the thought of going forward felt wrong. So I decided to retrace my steps. It would be safer, and I was still a few hours away from the trailhead. I packed up my gear and began heading back the way I had come. That was when it happened. A crack, louder than anything I had heard all day, echoed through the trees. I snapped my head to the side, immediately reaching for my whistle and the knife I kept tucked in my pocket. My breath caught in my throat. Out of nowhere, something, a person or something that resembled one, stepped into the clearing. They weren't far, maybe 20 yards away, standing perfectly still, like they had been waiting for me to look. The figure was tall, wearing a tattered jacket, and the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting everything in a shadow. I couldn't make out much, but it was enough to know I wasn't imagining things. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring. My heart pounded as I stood frozen. Everything in my body screamed to run, to turn around and sprint, but I stayed there, rooted to the spot. I didn't want to make any sudden moves, not with that eerie silence surrounding me. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of the figure against the fading light, but there was something unsettling about how still they were. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally moved. Slowly, methodically, it stepped into the trees, disappearing from sight without a sound. For a long time, I stayed there, trying to collect myself. My mind raced. Should I stay here? Should I run? I was starting to feel the weight of the situation. I had no idea who that person was or what their intentions were. I could still feel the hairs on the back of my neck, and my heart was still racing, but I decided that I wouldn't just stand there and wait. With adrenaline coursing through me, I decided to head back, not taking the same trail but cutting across a section of the mountain that led me downhill in a different direction. The entire time, I kept my eyes peeled, watching every movement in the shadows. Every snap of a twig, every rustling in the underbrush sent my mind spinning. But after about an hour of hiking at a faster pace than I was used to, I finally reached the bottom of the mountain. By the time I reached my car, it was nearly dark, and the thought of leaving the trailhead behind made me feel an overwhelming sense of relief. I never saw the figure again. I never heard anything else. But the memory of it, of the way it had just stood there waiting, stuck with me. The next morning, when I checked in with my friends, I told them about the odd experience, but I left out the part about the figure. It wasn't that I was ashamed, but I just didn't know how to explain it. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I finished my trip safely, and I've since learned to trust my instincts more than I ever did before. When I reflect on that hike, I'm still not sure who or what I encountered that day, but I do know that I've learned to pay more attention to my surroundings, especially when the forest feels too quiet.